The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, steady buzz that vibrated against the back of Anton's skull. He stood in the aisle, fingers brushing against plastic packaging. He grabbed a bag of chips and a sugary soda, the weight of the items familiar and comforting. He walked to the counter, tossed them down, and tapped his card against the reader. A sharp beep signaled the transaction. The screen flashed, "Approved," in bright green letters. He shrugged, scooped up his purchase, and turned toward the glass exit door. He took 3 steps before a weight suddenly pressed onto his left shoulder.
He froze. A voice, thin and sharp as a needle, pierced the air near his ear. That was not a snack,
it said. Anton spun around, stumbling into a display rack. Perched on his shoulder was a figure no taller than a coffee mug, balancing perfectly on the fabric. The tiny man pointed a finger at the receipt dangling from Anton's hand. That was a financial leak, the figure stated. Anton stood motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the miniature man who had just materialized from thin air. The exit door remained 10 feet away, but he could not bring himself to take another step. The accountant did not wait for a response. He tapped the empty air with a tiny, calloused finger. A grid of golden light erupted from his fingertip, hovering between them like a glowing curtain. Anton leaned in, his breath hitching. The numbers began to dance and lock into place. $5 a day, $150 a month, $18,000 over a decade. The accountant swiped his hand across the projection, and the lines converged into a single pulsing total. Invested at 7%, the tiny man muttered, "That is $25,000. Anton stared at the glowing digits. They seemed to burn into his retinas, casting long, shifting shadows against the store shelves. He looked down at the bag of chips in his hand. The plastic crinkled, a loud, jarring sound in the sudden quiet of the aisle. He calculated the weight of the chips against the weight of the projection. $25,000. His grip on the snack loosened. "I am trading a vacation for a snack," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. The accountant folded his arms, his expression unreadable, waiting for the weight of the math to settle into Anton's mind. The store aisle dissolved, leaving Anton standing in a room illuminated by a harsh, clinical white light. Before him stood 3 figures, each a mirror reflection of his own life. On the left stood Anton today, his pockets empty, hands trembling. To the right stood a version of himself, steady and calm, holding a leather-bound ledger. But it was the third figure that drew his gaze. The version with bad habits was hunched over, buried beneath a mountain of overdue bills and glowing notification screens. The paper mountain shifted and groaned, threatening to collapse at any moment. Anton today looked from the calm ledger keeper to the man suffocating under debt. The urgency of the choice tightened in his chest. He saw the ledger keeper methodically setting aside cash into a growing fund, while the other version frantically swiped at his phone, eyes darting in search of a distraction that never came. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Anton's own ragged breathing. He realized then that he was not just looking at possibilities, he was looking at his own trajectory. He took a step forward, the floor beneath him cold and unyielding, and prepared to choose which version he would become. Anton approached the desk, his movements deliberate. He pulled a chair out, the wood scraping against the floor, and sat down. He laid out a fresh notebook, the pages stark and inviting. He picked up a pen, the weight of it feeling different in his hand than it had minutes ago. At the very top of the page, he wrote in bold, firm letters, "Pay yourself first." He paused, letting the ink dry, then moved his hand to the center of the page. He drew a simple, circular outline. He labeled it, "Future Anton," and shaded the edges. He looked down at his imaginary paycheck, visualizing the total. He calculated 10%, then carefully drew a line from the paycheck to the jar. As the ink touched the paper, the drawing began to shimmer. A soft, golden warmth radiated from the page, illuminating the desktop. The jar was no longer just a sketch. It held a tangible weight of potential. Anton watched, mesmerized. as the light pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. For the first time, the future did not look like an abstract threat. It looked like a project he could hold. He reached out, touching the glowing paper, and felt the hum of stability beneath his fingertips. Anton looked away from the glowing jar and turned his attention to the bottom half of the page. He pulled a red pen from his pocket, the tip sharp and demanding. He began to list his daily purchases, the coffee, the subscription he never used, the late-night digital impulse buys. Each item felt small in the moment, a minor transaction of a few dollars. But as he wrote them down, the list grew long, snaking down the page like a vine.
He began to circle them. The red ink left thick, jagged borders around every entry. He pressed the pen down with enough force to indent the paper. These were not just costs. They were anchors. He looked at the list of subscriptions, seeing them not as services, but as automated leaks siphoning his future into the pockets of others. The silence of the room felt heavier now, charged with the sudden, sharp realization that he had been funding his own stagnation. He crossed out each item with a single brutal stroke.
The red ink bled into the fibers of the page. He looked at the accountant, who nodded, his tiny face unblinking. Anton realized that every one of these habits was a choice he had made unconsciously. He capped the pen, the click echoing in the room, and stared at the red-marked page. The truth was painful, but for the first time, it was clear. Anton shifted the notebook to a fresh section. He drew 2 intersecting lines, creating a clean, empty graph. He marked the horizontal axis with years and the vertical with total value. He started with a low contribution, drawing a line that crawled forward like a snail. It barely rose above the baseline. He frowned, then looked at the accountant. The small figure gestured toward the pen. Anton pressed down harder. He recalculated, this time tripling the monthly investment. He drew the second line. It started the same, but halfway across the page, it bent sharply upward, climbing at an impossible angle. The gap between the 2 lines widened into a chasm. Anton traced the steep curve with his fingertip. The projected total jumped from $17,000 to $50,000. The room seemed to shrink as the scale of the difference settled into his mind. He dropped the pen. It clattered against the desk, rolling to the edge. He breathed out, a long, ragged sound. The numbers were not just ink anymore. They were a trajectory. Small money, when disciplined, became a force of nature. He looked from the graph to his own hands, realizing the power to change his life had been sitting in his bank account all along, waiting for a decision. Anton rose from the desk and walked toward the far wall. 3 doors stood before him, each labeled with a different path. He reached for the first handle, cold metal under his palm. He pushed. Inside, a single coin rested on a pedestal, reflecting the dim light. He closed it and moved to the second. The door groaned on its hinges. He stepped through, seeing the words, "If you can wait, you can win," carved into the stone floor. He looked back at the accountant, who gestured toward the final door. Anton pushed it wide. A vision solidified in the air, his older self standing on a balcony, overlooking a quiet city, movements slow and deliberate. He touched the doorframe, his fingers tracing the wood. 2 timelines flickered before him. One showed a man sprinting to catch paychecks, his face lined with constant, frantic worry. The other showed a man standing still, his choices defined by freedom. Anton turned to the accountant, his voice steady. "I do not want to survive," he said, his gaze fixed on the balcony vision. "I want to build." He stepped forward, leaving the shadow of his past behind, ready to claim the structure he had only just begun to design. The accountant stepped closer to the wall and traced a long, sweeping arc in the air with a glowing finger. The line began flat, hugging the bottom of the grid. "Most people quit because it is slow," the accountant explained, his voice echoing in the chamber. but it is slow until it is fast. Anton stood perfectly still as the light expanded. The grid transformed. Year 1 appeared as a small, insignificant blip on the horizon. Year 5 emerged, rising like a mountain range from the plain. By year 20, the line had surged off the top of the wall, reaching toward the ceiling. Anton watched the years blur, seeing the steady accumulation of capital turn into a self-sustaining engine. He felt the weight of his previous choices dissolve. He was not just hoarding coins or tracking digits on a screen. He was carving out space in his own life. "I am not building money," Anton whispered, his eyes following the peak of the curve. "I am building time." The frantic pulse of his old life faded, replaced by the calm, rhythmic expansion of his future. He reached out, his hand passing through the golden light of the graph, and finally understood the freedom he was constructing. Anton walked to the center of the room. A clean, white board waited. He picked up a black marker, felt the weight of it in his hand, and pressed the tip against the smooth surface. He wrote 3 lines, the squeak of the marker loud in the quiet air. "Habits create financial stability," he wrote. He paused, looked at the accountant, and added the next line, "Decisions create habits." He finished with a flourish, "Mindset creates your future." He stepped back, the board filled with the blueprint of his life. He looked at the words, then turned toward the camera. He did not look like the man who had been stressed over a bag of chips. His posture was open, his gaze locked and steady. "You do not need to be rich to start," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "You just need to start." He placed the marker on the tray with a soft click. The board remained, a clear roadmap of the journey ahead. He stood there, silent for a long beat, letting the weight of the final lesson settle. The room around him felt different now. It was no longer a place of confusion, but a space of creation. He had the plan, he had the mindset, and for the first time, he had the time. The room began to soften. The harsh, bright lights dimmed, casting long, gentle shadows across the whiteboard. Anton remained in the frame for a moment longer, his figure still and resolute against the fading light. He watched the words he had written, their black ink standing out against the white surface like a promise. The accountant, now a small shadow on his shoulder, gave a single, knowing nod before stepping back into the dimness, one by one. The other versions of Anton, the frantic man with the phone, and the steady planner with the ledger dissolved into the surrounding quiet. The space felt open, stripped of clutter and noise, leaving only the clarity of the path ahead. Anton turned away from the camera, walking slowly toward the darkness at the edge of the room. The light on the whiteboard was the last thing to go. It lingered, holding the message in the emptiness before the frame finally surrendered to the dark. Then, centered in the void, the words appeared in sharp, steady white text. Small habits, big future. The silence held the screen, leaving the weight of the choice entirely to the viewer.